There are places in America where maps end not because the land runs out, but because no one dares to mark what lies beyond. Deep in the mist-soaked woods of West Virginia, where even the birds seem afraid to sing, stands the decaying shell of a house locals pretend doesn't exist. Once, it belonged to the Whitaker family. Some called them cursed. Others said they were proof of what happens when blood refuses to mix with anything but itself. When the first investigators reached that place, they expected nothing more than superstition and ruin. But in the dust-choked corners of the cabin, they found portraits, faces covered with cloth, eyes hollow yet alive, as though the women behind those masks could still see through time. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with something older than decay. Even the sunlight, when it touched those walls, seemed to hesitate. Locals whispered that the Whitaker sisters never removed their masks, not even to sleep, not even to breathe the night air. Some said the masks were punishment. Others believed they were protection, from what? No one could say. What is certain is this: the further one walks into those woods, the quieter the world becomes. And if you listen long enough, beneath the hum of insects and wind through the trees, you might still hear it, 3 faint voices humming a hymn no one remembers anymore. The discovery of the cabin came almost by accident. The documentary crew hadn't set out looking for the Whitakers. Their project began as a film about forgotten Appalachian families and the decay of rural America. But on the 3rd day of their trip, deep in the shadowed thickets of Raleigh County, they stumbled upon a dirt trail that wasn't on any map. It wound through skeletal trees and led them into a part of the woods that locals had warned them to avoid. The air there was unnaturally still, as though even nature had given up on the place. When they finally saw the cabin through the fog, it looked less like a structure and more like something that had grown from the earth itself, its roof sagging, its walls half swallowed by vines, its windows opaque with grime. No birds perched on the roof. No sound of life came from inside. It stood alone, forgotten, yet somehow waiting. The front steps collapsed under the crew's weight, sending up a puff of dust that smelled of rot and old rain. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. It reeked of rusted metal and mold, mixed with something faintly sweet that no one could name. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, revealing a single room filled with broken furniture, jars of preserved fruit long turned to sludge, and a Bible open on the floor as if someone had left it there in a hurry. One of the crew members, a historian named Laura, noticed something strange about the walls. Beneath the peeling wallpaper were dozens of handprints pressed into the wood, small and uneven, as though made by someone desperate to get out or desperate to stay in. They began filming, capturing every inch of the cabin's ruin, unaware that the lens was already capturing things they couldn't see. A faint humming could be heard when they played back the first recording later that night, though none of them remembered hearing it while inside. Outside the house, a narrow path led to what once might have been a garden. Now it was nothing but tangled weeds and the faint outline of 3 wooden crosses, each marked with a name too faded to read. The discovery unsettled the group, but they told themselves it was nothing more than remnants of a bygone family graveyard, common in these parts. Yet the deeper they looked, the more it felt like the house was watching them. When one of them turned back toward the cabin from the edge of the clearing, they swore they saw movement through the cracked window, a flicker of white, like fabric shifting in the dark. It was the moment they realized the Whitaker home wasn't abandoned at all. It had just been waiting for someone to open the door again. When the crew returned to the nearest town, a small, nearly forgotten settlement called Dunlow, they expected to find people willing to share the Whitaker's story. Instead, they were met with silence so thick it felt rehearsed. The old diner at the center of town served as the only place with life, but when the name Whitaker was mentioned, forks froze mid-air, eyes dropped to coffee cups, and the waitress who had been smiling moments ago suddenly lost all color in her face. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from ignorance, it was the kind born of memory, of things people had chosen to bury. The crew pressed for answers, offering payment, promising anonymity, but each attempt ended the same way, with a hand gesture toward the door and the muttered warning that some stories aren't meant to be told. That night, they stayed in a creaky roadside motel where the owner, an old man with a limp, slipped a folded note under their door. It read, "Don't go back to that house after dark." They never left. The words were written in trembling handwriting, smeared as though written in haste. When they went to ask him what he meant, his room was locked, and by morning, he was gone. The sheriff, when approached for comment, offered a polite but firm refusal. "We don't investigate ghosts," he said, his tone clipped, though his eyes betrayed unease. One of the younger deputies, lingering near the doorway, whispered to the crew that his grandmother used to say the Whitaker sisters wore masks not to hide deformity, but to keep something inside them from escaping. When he realized he'd spoken too much, he excused himself and left the station without another word. Even the town's church, usually a place of confession, provided no comfort. The pastor, a man whose voice trembled with fatigue, told them only that the Whitakers were a lesson in what happens when sin becomes blood. He refused to elaborate. A local store clerk, after being offered a generous bribe, muttered that there were once photographs kept in the library showing the sisters, but those had been taken away a long time ago. When asked by whom, he simply replied, "By those who didn't want the truth to spread." Every door seemed to close tighter the more questions they asked. By the end of the second day, the entire town appeared to have turned against them, eyes following from behind curtains, whispers trailing them through the streets. What began as journalistic curiosity shifted into a creeping sense that the people of Dunlow weren't protecting the Whitakers, they were protecting themselves from whatever the Whitakers had become. The discovery of the old photographs happened late in the afternoon, when the fog had begun to roll down the hills and settle like breath over the forest floor. The crew had returned to the Whitaker cabin, driven by the frustration of silence from the townspeople and the lure of unfinished answers. Inside, the air was heavier than before, thick with the damp musk of age. Laura, the historian, was searching through a warped dresser when she found a rusted tin box wedged behind a loose floorboard. It was sealed shut with a nail, but a gentle tap from a flashlight broke it open. Inside were old photographs, black and white, curled with time, their surfaces mottled by moisture and decay. Each picture showed the same three women, standing or sitting in various corners of the cabin, their faces hidden behind white masks. The strange part wasn't just that the masks were there, but that the photographs were clearly taken indoors, as if the sisters never allowed their faces to be seen, not even within the safety of their home. As the crew spread the photographs across the dusty floor, they noticed that in every image, the women seemed to be staring directly at the camera, their posture unnervingly still. The light in the photos was faint, almost unnatural, as though coming from a single lantern. Behind the sisters, the cabin appeared exactly as it did now, same wallpaper, same cracks in the wood, suggesting that little had changed since the day those photos were taken. One of the men, Carter, pointed out something chilling. In one photo, a fourth figure could be seen reflected faintly in a mirror behind the sisters, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. But when they checked the next picture, taken seconds later, that figure was gone. As night fell, they decided to scan the images using a portable device to preserve them for analysis. When the images appeared on their laptop screen, the details were sharper than expected, and something none of them had noticed before emerged. In the background of one photograph, behind the sisters, a window revealed the outline of someone standing outside the cabin, another masked face, watching in from the dark. A chill ran through the room as Laura whispered that the photographer must have been one of them, that these images were never meant to be seen by anyone outside the family. But what unsettled them most was the final photo, stuck to the bottom of the box. It was newer, taken decades later, on color film. The same three masks. The same room. Only this time, the lantern was still burning, and on the back, written in a trembling hand, were the words, "We never took them off." The discovery of the sealed door came the following evening, when the crew decided to conduct a full exploration of the cabin. They had documented every visible room but kept circling back to one narrow hallway that seemed oddly shorter than it should have been. The structure didn't make sense, the exterior suggested another chamber existed beyond the back wall. Guided by instinct and unease, they began knocking along the wood until a hollow thud echoed back from behind a shelf. Moving it aside, they found a boarded section of wall roughly the size of a door, its edges lined with rusted nails and splintered wood. The boards were old, layered over each other, as though someone had been desperate to ensure whatever was inside stayed hidden. Faint scratch marks streaked the surface from the inside out, the wood splintered where fingers, or something like them, had clawed to get free. The air changed the moment they pried loose the first nail. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath becoming visible even though it wasn't cold outside. The smell that followed was enough to make them all step back, a mix of iron, mildew, and something unmistakably organic, like decaying flesh that had soaked into the grain of the wood. Carter tried to joke that they'd found an animal's nest, but his voice cracked midway, betraying his fear. When the final board gave way, the door beneath it appeared, a narrow, rotting slab of oak with a latch that had long since fused shut. The hinges shrieked when they forced it open, echoing through the house like a scream. Behind it was a small room no bigger than a closet. At the far end of the tiny chamber sat a small wooden chair facing the wall. On the seat was an old porcelain doll with a cracked face and missing eyes. Someone had tied a mask around its head too. As they stood in stunned silence, the flashlight flickered, and a soft thud came from behind the wall as though something had shifted inside the cabin's bones. They froze, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Still, none of them could shake the feeling that opening that door hadn't just revealed a secret, it had released one. The discovery of the family Bible came after a night of restless sleep and unspoken dread. The crew had agreed to stay one final day at the cabin to catalog their findings before heading back to town, but dawn arrived heavy and colorless, as if the forest itself disapproved of their decision. The morning air inside the house was dense, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and something burnt. While searching through the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, Laura found an old chest beneath a collapsed bed frame. Inside it lay a collection of brittle papers, a rosary blackened by age, and a large, leather-bound Bible wrapped in cloth. The cover was warped and soft from years of moisture, but the gold lettering on the front was still legible. The Whitaker Family Bible, 1894. When she opened it, the first few pages were blank, but deeper within, the book transformed from scripture into something else entirely. The margins were filled with handwritten notes, dates, and symbols that seemed to merge religion with obsession. Then came the family tree. At first glance, it appeared typical, names connected by neat lines and generations carefully recorded, but as her eyes followed the branches, patterns began to emerge that defied normal lineage. The same surnames repeated across multiple generations, first cousins married to first cousins, siblings linked in ways that blurred where one bloodline ended and another began. Several names were crossed out violently, as if the writer wanted to erase them from existence. Others were circled, annotated with single, chilling words, *impure*, *forgiven*, *masked*. The deeper Laura read, the stranger it became. A passage written in the same ink as the family tree read, "The Lord demands purity of flesh. What is born of our own shall not be defiled by strangers." It was followed by a warning, "The mask is our covenant. It keeps sin contained. Without it, the curse breathes." There were also dates written beside certain names, sometimes followed by a short phrase like asterisk taken to the cellar asterisk or asterisk buried without eyes asterisk. The handwriting grew erratic toward the final pages, the ink darker, almost smeared, as if written in desperation. As the others gathered around her, the air in the room thickened. The Bible wasn't a record of faith, it was a record of decay, chronicling a family that mistook devotion for damnation. Near the very end of the book was a final entry written in shaking letters: "The sisters remain. They bear our mark. When the mask is lifted, we all shall see." No one spoke for several minutes after that. They simply stood there, the forest murmuring beyond the cracked window, and each one felt the same unspoken truth settle like dust in their lungs. The Whitakers hadn't been trying to keep evil out. They had been trying to keep it in. The night the radio turned on by itself was the first time the crew truly felt the house breathing. They had gathered in the living room to review the day's footage, exhaustion thick in their movements, when the sound came, a sharp crackle from the corner where an old, dust-covered radio sat beneath a sheet. None of them remembered seeing it before. The power in the cabin was long dead, yet the radio's dials began to twitch, the static growing louder as though something was pushing through from another frequency. Carter reached over, hesitated, then pulled the cloth away. The radio was ancient, its wooden casing chipped, its knobs stiff with rust, but the speaker trembled as though alive. At first, the static was just noise, but then came the faint sound of breathing, slow, uneven, and human. They exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to explain it away, but the sound didn't stop. Instead, it deepened into a whisper, too soft to understand yet unmistakably speaking. Laura, recording the moment on her camera, noticed that the cabin seemed to hum with the same low frequency. The light bulb hanging above them flickered despite not being connected to any power source. Then, through the static, a voice began to take shape, fragile, old, and wavering like wind through dead leaves. It spoke one word at a time, each separated by a hiss of silence. Eleanor. Mary. Ruth. The names sent a chill through the room. They were the same names written in the Whitaker family Bible. Carter turned the dial, hoping to catch a clearer signal, but the voice grew agitated, repeating the names faster, layered with another sound, something wet, like the slow drag of a breath through water. Laura stepped closer, asking if anyone else could hear the faint hum beneath the words, a rhythm almost like a lullaby. The others nodded. When the voice finally paused, a faint knocking sound followed, not from the radio this time but from within the wall behind it, 3 slow knocks, then silence. No one moved for nearly a minute. Then the radio, still untouched, shifted to a low tone that vibrated through the floorboards. The camera captured the moment the sound cut off abruptly, followed by a flash of static that distorted their recordings. When they replayed the footage later that night, the voice came through clearer than before, whispering a new phrase none of them had heard in real time: "We are still here." From that moment, it was as if the house had acknowledged them not as visitors, but as participants in a story that had never ended. And somewhere within the static, between the breaths and the silence, the Whitaker sisters had begun to answer back. The journal of the eldest sister was discovered the morning after the radio incident, when none of the crew had truly slept. The storm that rolled through the night had shaken the cabin, rattling windows and howling through the cracks, yet amidst the chaos, something had fallen from the top shelf of a wardrobe in the back room. It was a small, leather-bound book tied shut with brittle string, its cover stained by moisture and what looked like candle wax. Laura untied it carefully, the pages fragile and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible in the morning light that barely broke through the trees. The first few entries seemed harmless, domestic notes about weather, harvest, and repairs to the cabin, but as the writing continued, it shifted from the ordinary to the unnerving. The author, identified through one of the early entries as Eleanor Whitaker, wrote with a restrained, almost fearful tone. Her handwriting grew tighter and more erratic with each passing page, describing the sickness that grows within our faces and the whispers that return when the masks are removed. She wrote about the 3 sisters herself, Mary, and Ruth, and their mother, who she described as both holy and cursed. According to Eleanor, their mother had begun the mask ritual after the birth of the youngest sister. She claimed it was a divine commandment, revealed to her through dreams filled with smoke and faceless figures. The masks, Eleanor wrote, were the only barrier between our blood and the air that carries the curse. The entries painted a picture of a family trapped in fear and ritual. Each time a mask was removed, Eleanor claimed something in the house would awaken, scratching in the walls, the sound of someone weeping outside the windows though no one was there. She spoke of punishments for those who disobeyed, of being forced to kneel while their mother prayed over them until their skin blistered from the candle flame. One entry described Mary trying to run away into the woods, only to return the next morning covered in mud, her mask gone and her mouth sewn shut with black thread to keep the air from spilling out. Toward the final pages, the writing grew desperate, the words slanted and trembling. "We are not wearing them to hide," Eleanor wrote. "We wear them to keep what's inside from breathing free. The masks are not our shame. They are our chains." The last page bore a smear of something dark across the paper, and beneath it, in faint handwriting, a final line that seemed less a confession than a prophecy: "When the last mask falls, the curse will breathe again." As Laura read the words aloud, a wind stirred through the cracks of the cabin walls, carrying with it a whisper that sounded eerily like a sigh of relief. The discovery of the hidden well happened just as the crew decided they had seen enough of the inside of the house. The atmosphere had become unbearable, heavy with the scent of mildew and something they could not name. The decision to explore the exterior came as an excuse to escape the suffocating tension, but the woods offered little comfort. The air outside was thick and damp, and the sound of insects had vanished completely, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Behind the cabin, where the ground dipped into a patch of wild grass, Laura noticed a series of stones arranged in a near-perfect circle. At first, they thought it might be an old fire pit, but when Carter brushed away the overgrowth, they realized it was a well, its rim lined with moss-covered bricks, and its opening sealed beneath a sheet of rusted iron. The metal was sunken in the middle, bowed by time and pressure, and the edges were chained down as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed closed. The group approached it cautiously. The chains were old but strong, locked by a padlock that had fused shut from decades of exposure. There was a faint smell rising through the cracks, like stagnant water mixed with something sour. Laura, kneeling beside it, pressed her ear against the cool metal and thought she heard movement from below, a soft, irregular splash followed by a sound that might have been breathing. Carter dismissed it as echo, but his voice lacked conviction. They debated whether to open it, each suggestion drowned by the growing wind that swept through the trees. Then, without warning, the chains rattled. It was subtle at first, like the vibration of distant thunder, but it came again, harder this time, loud enough for everyone to hear. Panic flickered across their faces, yet curiosity outweighed fear. Using a crowbar, they pried at the edge of the plate until the lock gave way with a shriek that echoed into the trees. The stench that rose from the well was overpowering. They covered their mouths as Carter directed his flashlight downward. The beam barely reached the bottom, illuminating nothing but dark water that rippled even though no stone had been thrown. Laura leaned closer and saw, just below the surface, something pale moving slowly in circles, too large to be an animal, too deliberate to be current. Then, for a fraction of a second, it looked up. A human face, white as paper, eyes open but unblinking, turned toward the light before sinking back into the blackness. They stumbled backward, slamming the metal plate closed and securing it with the chains once more. No one spoke for several minutes. The forest seemed to exhale around them, as if satisfied. But as they began to retreat toward the cabin, the faint metallic clinking of the chains echoed behind them, steady, rhythmic, and deliberate, like fingers tapping from below. By the time morning came, the forest had turned gray with fog so thick it erased the horizon. None of the crew had slept. They huddled near the lantern light, jumpy at every creak of the floor. Laura's hands still trembled from what they had seen in the well, and Carter refused to speak about it at all. They decided to pack and leave, but as they stepped outside, something immediately felt wrong. The cabin door was open wider than they remembered, swaying slightly in the wind, and the air smelled faintly of iron again. It wasn't until Laura began to collect their equipment that she noticed one of the masks they had found inside the hidden room was missing. It had been sitting on the table with the others, but now the space was empty, a thin outline of dust marking where it had been. None of them had touched it. Carter accused one of the others of moving it, but the argument died quickly when they noticed a trail of mud leading from the doorway toward the edge of the trees. The prints were faint but unmistakable, bare feet, smaller than an adult's, each step deep enough to suggest something heavy had been carried. The path ended at the clearing where their tents stood, and there, beside Laura's tent flap, lay the mask. It was half buried in wet soil, the inside smeared with something dark and sticky, as if it had been pressed against skin. Laura picked it up cautiously, her voice breaking as she whispered that it was warm. They checked the footage from the camera they'd left running overnight. The timestamp showed movement around 2:17 a.m., a shadow crossing the frame just beyond the cabin window, humanoid in shape but bent and unsteady. It lingered for several seconds before vanishing into the direction of the tents. The camera lens then caught something else, a glimpse of pale fabric drifting past the screen, as though someone had walked by wearing one of the masks. The footage ended abruptly with a burst of static. The realization settled slowly but completely. Something had left the cabin during the night. Whether it had followed them or had always been waiting, none of them could tell. Laura insisted they leave immediately, her voice trembling, but before they could pack everything, they heard movement from inside the house again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging across the floorboards. Only now, there were 3 distinct sets of them. The air outside seemed to pulse with every creak. As the sound drew closer, the missing mask slipped from Laura's hands and landed face up in the mud, the hollow eyes staring toward the cabin door, waiting for what was coming through it. The final photograph was found just after dawn, when the air had grown so still that even the fog seemed afraid to move. The crew had spent the night in terror, too frightened to step back inside the cabin after the footsteps, yet too disoriented to leave through the dark woods. When daylight finally came, weak and grey, they entered cautiously to gather their remaining gear. The interior was colder than before, as if the warmth of life had been drained from it. The walls glistened faintly with moisture, and the faint humming they had heard days ago now seemed to linger in the air, barely audible but constant. Carter was the first to notice the Polaroid camera sitting on the table, something none of them had brought with them. It was old but functional, its white plastic streaked with grime and the faint outline of a handprint on its surface. Inside the film compartment was a single, freshly developed photograph. They hesitated to touch it, half afraid of what it might show. Laura finally picked it up, her fingers shaking as she turned it toward the light. The image captured the interior of the cabin exactly as it looked at that moment, the same overturned chairs, the same Bible on the floor, but there was one horrifying difference. In the corner of the frame stood 3 women, their heads tilted, faces covered by the same white masks that had haunted every photograph in the box. They weren't faint or ghostly. They were solid, clear, and standing directly behind the crew. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Carter, his voice barely audible, whispered that the picture must have been taken minutes ago. The realization struck all at once. The camera had been used while they were outside. Someone, or something, had been there with them. Panic spread as they scrambled for their equipment, but before they could leave, the Polaroid in Laura's hand began to fade. The figures in the photo shifted slightly, as though moving closer. A faint crackling sound came from the radio again, and through it, the same soft voice whispered, "Stay with us." They ran. The forest seemed to close in around them, every tree a shadow, every branch a reaching hand. When they finally reached the main road, none of them dared to look back. Later, when the footage from their cameras was reviewed by local authorities, one frame appeared at the very end of the recording, an image not taken by any of them. It showed the crew walking away from the cabin, their faces turned forward, and behind them, standing in the open doorway, the Whitaker sisters in their masks, perfectly still, as if posing for one final family portrait.